All right, we are live. Welcome to episode 79 of the Jackson Rudolph podcast. I am your host, Jackson Rudolph, and this is one of our first truly live episodes. As many of you know that tune in regularly, I've recently made the transition to medical school, so we were doing reruns for a few weeks, so I was kind of in that process. But now I am fully ingrained in medical school, just finished up week 5 of my medical education. It's flying fast. We've already taken our first round of exams, and we'll be having some more finals coming up right before the Diamond Nationals here in a couple of weeks. So I'll be taking those finals at the before the Diamond Nationals, and then trying to fly over there and get to the event to see all the action and be a part of it. So super excited for everything that is to come. And with all the changes in my life right now, I am going to be experimenting with some new scheduling for the podcast. So we might do some more live episodes like this, try to engage the viewers like you guys a little bit more. And so I really wanted to start this kind of new string of live sessions by addressing a lot of your questions. I know that right now, coming out of the COVID-19 era, or at least hopefully soon coming out of the COVID-19 era, there's a lot of change happening in sport karate, and there's a lot of conversation. We've got a lot of great people in the sport karate community that are promoting discussion. There's more discussion boards than ever before. There's more podcasts than ever before that are talking about these topics and these issues within the sport that we all love so much. And so I'm excited to be a part of it. I'm excited to be here. My competitive career, as most people know, is closer to its end than its beginning, but that's because I'm 23 years old and a medical student now. But I love sport karate, so you'll never be able to truly pull me away from this sport. I'll always be around coaching students and hopefully in the broadcast booth commentating various events. And so this is something that I'm in for the long haul, as so many of you that are tuning in, because we love what we do, right? And that's why we're here tonight, is to just have some conversation. I'm going to talk about some upcoming topics. I was very fortunate. Some people chimed in the comment section leading up to this episode, talking about, how unique it was to have somebody who's been a world champion level competitor on multiple leagues talking about some of these issues. And so it's an honor for me to be able to start some of these discussions. So a lot of this has just been filler here at the beginning of the show as I ramble a little bit while people keep tuning in. If any questions pop up, I've got my comments pulled up here, so feel free to drop those questions in the comments below as they come. But for the majority of the show, I'm going to be kind of going through a lot of the pre-submitted comments that I got asking various questions. So we're pretty much going to go right in the order that I received them, unless I see anything happening in the comments. Then I'll pick up on those questions that are coming in. And so I'm going to switch over to my phone here. And the top comment, the first comment that came up, was by Richard Osborne, who's the creator of the Open Martial Arts Tournament discussion page, who's created a lot of really great discussions recently with that page. So thank you, Mr. Osborne, for all the work you've been doing with that. And so he asks, honestly, I want to hear your thoughts on what we need to do moving forward on the sport, what's working, what needs improvement, how can we increase competitors from closed circuits, ATA, Tiger Rock, etc. So I'm going to work backwards on that question a little bit because I first want to talk about that last comment, which is how can we increase competitors from closed circuits, ATA, Tiger Rock, etc. And honestly, I don't think that should be a major goal for the open leagues, because open leagues offer a completely different product than what your closed circuits, ATA, and Tiger Rock offer. ATA, Tiger Rock, and similar closed circuits offer a field of competition for those that have been brought up in their system to compete against each other, which has benefits outside of kind of a smaller pool of competitors to compete in, so you can make an argument that you could maybe win some titles more quickly because it's not against everybody, it's against a smaller population. But there's much more to it than that. Look at traditional forms, for example. Can you imagine a world and an open circuit where in traditional forms the same style of form is being compared against one another, so we don't have this age-old debate of, well, why does Japanese win more often than Korean? In ATA, they don't have to worry about it because everybody's running the same style of form, right? And so I do feel that there's a niche that the closed circuits serve, and I don't think that part of the open circuit ideology has to be that we need to get these competitors from the closed circuits to come over to the open circuit. There's also this stigma that if you're going to make the jump, so to speak, that you have to stop doing the closed circuit competition and move over into the open circuit competition, which I don't agree with, right? If you want to do ATA, for example, but you also want to come and chase a NASCAR World Championship, chase them both. If your family has the funds and the resources and the time to be able to do that, then by all means do that. There's nothing wrong with participating in a closed circuit while simultaneously participating in an open circuit, again, given that you have the resources, the time, the funds, all of that available to do that. And then really, within, let's say that you don't have unlimited resources, like most of us don't, right? And you have to pick, well, I'm going to travel an open circuit, or I'm going to do a closed circuit, or maybe I've only got the resources to save up all my money and do the singular world championship events at the end of the year, like a WKC or WKU. You can, maybe make the time to do the tryout and then go and do the world championships as well, right? I think that there's different benefits to choosing any of those different leagues, right? Let's say that a goal of yours is to become an ATA ambassador and climb the chain of the ATA and be an ambassador for that league. NASCAR doesn't have any type of an ambassador, right? Maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't, I don't know. But if that is your goal, then of course you're gonna wanna travel within that closed circuit. Or if you're going for rank advancements within that closed circuit, whatever the case may be, right? There's reasons that you would choose one over the other. Whereas the benefits to open circuit, NASCAR in particular, are the multiple rounds of competition. This is a big one that I talk about with students all the time. A lot of those closed leagues, you have your division and then that's it. There's not a grand championship. There's not a runoff and then a night show. There's not these multiple rounds of competition. And I think that that's one of the great things that open circuit competition, particularly NASCAR competition, brings. I think I saw another post on a forum recently asking, what if we just got rid of grand championships and placed more emphasis on the divisions themselves? And a lot of competitors were commenting, well, I wouldn't compete. I compete for the grand championships. And I agree with that sentiment, right? The idea that there's more beyond your division, that you can go and you can try to beat the winners from potentially older age groups, or from let's say I won creative weapons and I get to test my skills against the winner of the extreme weapons division. And then if I win that, I can move on and perform in the night show and then test my skills against a traditional competitor in the current junior format. I think that that's something that has a lot of value. That's an additional challenge for a lot of competitors. And I think that that's the most important thing, right? If you're in sport karate, you don't do it for the fame, you don't do it for the money, because you don't get very much of any of those things, right? We do it for the love of the game. So the more rounds of competition that you can give me as a competitor, the more I'm going to appreciate that, because as a competitor, I want to be in the ring running my forms. And if I just had one division and then went home, let's say I did 8 divisions, that's 8 minutes of action and then I go home, right? No, I want to be able to move on to the next round and then have that time in between where, there's this nervousness in the room and this anticipation for runoffs. And then the same thing when you have that atmosphere getting ready for a night show stage. And we're going to talk about atmosphere here very shortly. But those are just a few of the little things, right, that separates the closed circuit tournaments from the open circuit tournaments, and why I don't think that we necessarily need to try to pull competitors from one to the other or anything like that. I think that they each serve their own niche, right? And I think that holds a lot of value. So now to address some more of the questions here. Looks like I got a text message coming in. Somebody just asked if I'm still going live. Yes, we're live right now. Join the stream. All right, so let's see. Now, Richard's overall question, going back to it, was what's working, what needs improvement, and I think that we're going to address a lot of that as we kind of move on through the show today. And again, feel free, interrupt, drop comments down below. If a question pops up or if something I say prompts another question, feel free, go ahead, drop those in the comments. We'll discuss those as well. It's one of the benefits of doing a live show is we can kind of have that interaction back and forth. Or if you're just dropping in, say hi, drop a like, leave a comment, say what's up, Jackson. But anyway, we're going to dive back in to some more questions here. All right, so we've got one from Christy Picotti. She asks, being you excel in martial arts and academics, how can we get this sport to the level of other sports with academic scholarships? Did your martial arts career help with academic scholarships? Would love to see this sport get to the level of other sports as far as school scholarships and such, ... right? So this is a tricky one because I do believe that my position in sport karate allowed me to have success in various elements and various aspects of the academic world. And I'll explain what I mean by that. But I never received any type of scholarship for my martial arts career, right? Instead, what I mean is twofold, right? The first is all of those tenets of martial arts that we learn growing up from the time that we're a white belt until we're, as a martial artist, you're always a student, right? So even through black belt and becoming an instructor and a master and all that, those tenets of martial arts directly apply to staying dedicated in school, staying focused, getting your work done, goal setting. All of those things are extremely important to being successful academically. So to any parents watching, maybe somehow you found this podcast and you're a parent of a child that does not do karate yet, just the general teachings of martial arts will make your kids better students. It goes hand in hand, and a lot of schools, martial arts schools that is, even reinforce academics. I remember there was a program at my original Taekwondo school where you could show off your report card and you got a special patch on your uniform for getting all A's. There was an academic achievement award in the martial arts school. So martial arts school owners, maybe that's a good program that you could start to try to inspire your students to do better academically. So there's kind of the general way that it helps, is that all martial artists should have a baseline level of goal setting and dedication that's going to help you in an academic setting. The other side of it is when I was in high school and applying to college, I didn't realize it then, but I certainly realized it in retrospect. As someone who's now a graduate of Stanford University, which is a school that the year I applied had like a 4.2% acceptance rate or something like that. So like ridiculously low acceptance rate. It was a dream come true and a blessing to get in. And kids ask me all the time, especially high school age kids, how did you do it? What was the secret? And I say it comes down to three things, right? The first is you've got to be good academically. You've got to have the great GPA. You've got to have the great standardized test scores, whether it's the ACT or the SAT or whatever it is they make you guys take now. So you've got to do well academically. That's the number one thing, right? That's a given. The number two thing, and what has to do the most with martial arts, is you have to have something that makes you stand out from the pack, right? You're not going to get into Stanford or Harvard or Yale just being another good student, because fortunately and unfortunately, there's a lot of really, really good students who did well and excelled academically. And so you need something like a career in sport karate. If you can write your essays about how you became a world champion and you suffered this obstacle, maybe you overcame an injury in your martial arts career, maybe as a child you were bullied and you overcame bullying through your martial arts and now you compete on stages all over the country at NASCA tournaments. Being able to tell a story like that carries a lot of value. And me personally, one of my goals is to become a surgeon. And in my college essays, I wrote about how at one point in martial arts, I went from being somebody that was a beginner and didn't know much, and I noticed a goal, I recognized a goal, I pushed through, I persevered, and I became the top-ranked competitor in the world at what I do. So I know what it takes to go from knowing nothing to being an expert in a field, and I was blessed to know that at a very young age. And I wrote about that in my essays and said, I want to do the same thing in the practice of medicine, right? I want to go from being somebody that admittedly is somebody from, a little high school in Kentucky, didn't know much about medicine, right? I, obviously did well in AP biology and all that stuff, but I didn't know anything about medicine, right? And so I wanted to go from somebody with little background to somebody that is an expert, that could be one of the best in the world in that field. And so being able to make that connection and telling those schools that you have that experience from the college application standpoint is extremely valuable. I mentioned there were three things. The third thing is you got to win the lottery, right? So you could be the best martial artist in the world and you could have all the best grades, and then you could just have bad luck and that one particular dream school misses your file, or it gets put in the wrong pile, or whatever happens, or it gets dropped in the wrong folder on somebody's computer, right? So the other thing is you can't let yourself get beat up over, especially when you're in the middle of the application cycle, right? If, you really wanted, this Ivy League school and, maybe you don't get it, but you still might get opportunities elsewhere, right? So when I say win the lottery, keep in mind, if you have these lofty goals, it's very, very difficult to achieve. And much like at a karate tournament, you don't have complete control over it. Once you send off your application, you're waiting to see what happens. Just like once you do your form, you stand in front of the judges and you wait to see what happens. After your form is done, after your application is submitted, there's nothing you can do. And so you can't concern yourself with that outcome because you have no control over the outcome at that point. So sit back, see what happens, respond to whatever happens, and make the most of that situation. And so that's how I would say, both kind of in a general sense and then a specific sense, my martial arts career impacted my career in academics and now being a medical student. And then as far as how do we bring the sport up to the level where there's going to be academic scholarships, this is something that I preach about all the time, is that we have to get the larger martial arts community as a whole to be accepting of sport karate. Because we have a massive, hundreds of millions of people around the world study martial arts in some capacity. And that's what allows pages like Black Belt Magazine to have such big followings, because there's these massive communities of martial artists, right? The unfortunate dilemma is that so often martial artists criticize other forms of martial arts, right? If you're a jiu-jitsu guy, then maybe you think that karate's worthless. Or if you're a taekwondo guy, maybe you think aikido's worthless, or whatever it is. I see these things all the time as somebody that's been kind of behind the scenes on some of the black belt social media before. I see these debates all the time, and, you know, the masters who think, well, my way is the right way, and everybody else, you know, that's not real martial arts, right? And so I think that making sport karate more marketable to the larger martial arts community so that we can rally those who already like martial arts in general, rally them, have them get behind us, and that's going to help us grow our audience more and more, right? In my opinion, if you take somebody who loves martial arts, truly loves martial arts, and you show them this other art form and you can convince them to embrace it, because it's entertaining, or because look at this level of skill that's required to do this particular thing in point fighting or in forms and weapons or whatever it may be, or look at these young kids and all the things that they can achieve in this sport, right? Whatever it is that's going to make that martial artist fall in love with the idea of sport karate is going to help make our community bigger as a whole. And when you grow that community as a whole, you develop leverage. When you get that leverage, the sport continues to grow. The bigger the sport gets, the more opportunities there are. And we talk about this a lot in the context of big sponsorships, right? If we want Gatorade to be interested in sponsoring sport karate has to get big enough for Gatorade to care, right? Because Gatorade sponsors the NFL and the NBA and all these big major leagues, right, of these sports that hundreds of millions of people watch on a weekly basis. And so if sport karate wants any chance of getting those corporate sponsors, not for individual teams like Paul Mitchell has, but over the entire league, we have to show how far-reaching that sport can be. And it's the same thing for academic scholarships, right? If you want to be able to get a scholarship for martial arts, then that school, just like that sponsor, has to be able to see the value in a competitor from that league, from NASCA, for example, wearing a Stanford logo, right? How much value does it bring Stanford if Jackson Rudolph wears their logo when he competes? It's not something that I ever brought to Stanford or anything like that, because I was very content with Paul Mitchell, and honestly, the thought never even came to my mind until now, right? But until the sport gets bigger, that's going to be a hard sell. So in order to get more corporate sponsorships for leagues, and in order to get more support from academic scholarship programs, which I guess would be an athletic scholarship because it's through martial arts, but you know what I mean. In order to get that, our sport has to grow as a whole, right? I see a comment came in. This is the great Carmichael Simon, a friend of the show. We've had him on before. We need to have him on again. Carmichael tuning in, he says, given you have a degree in pursuing continued education outside of martial arts, how different do you believe our sport would be if everyone in leadership roles had a degree, promoters, coaches, instructors, etc.? That's a great question. I do think that a lot of the powers that be in martial arts do have an education, and if they don't have an education, I know many of them to be smart people, right? And so I think it depends on what the degree was in, right? I think, you know, maybe if we had somebody who happened to have a master's of business administration, sure, maybe that would help with, you know, the pursuit of getting more corporate sponsors and things of that nature. But really, more than anything, I don't think it's a question of the individual intelligence, for lack of a better term, of the leadership. It's more about getting the leadership to work together, because we do have a lot of really smart people at the top of sport karate. It's not out of ignorance that sport karate is not bigger. It's out of a lack of unity, right? In my opinion, the most important thing is all of these major role players need to find a way to work together to make this sport bigger. Because just like I was talking about with different martial arts styles, right? Like, one style can never grow if a whole bunch of other styles just assume that that style is ridiculous or isn't effective or whatever the case may be, right? It's the same thing when you get these competitions between all these different martial arts leagues and, well, the rules should be this or the rules should be that, or we're going to compete here, or we're going to compete there. When you have so much division between all of these major role players, you can't combine that community. So whereas we could have a community of several 100,000 people, instead those communities are being split up into a community of 100,000 go into this league, and 50,000 go to this closed circuit, and 150,000 are in this big closed circuit. This other big open circuit has, 250,000 people, right? Instead of having all these different populations that have their own agenda, if some of these major role players could work together, our sport gets bigger automatically, because those communities are combined into one unified mission, right? And I know that's easier said than done, because there are right and wrong ways to go about things. Inevitably, there are some people who are going to have better, more effective business ideas and goals for the future of sport karate than others. But until we try those things, and as a group try to push for this acceleration of our sport, we're not going to know what works, right? I feel like one of the big problems is every time there's one of these, new big ideas, one person tries it and then they don't get the support, and then we don't really know if it would have worked out or not. And so, I'm a cheerleader of anybody that tries something new in sport karate. If you've got an idea that you think is going to elevate this sport, get more people involved, and ultimately make it a better sport for the athletes that participate in it, I'm always going to be behind that, right? Regardless of who it is that's doing it, right? So don't pledge allegiance to an individual or an idea or a circuit, but pledge allegiance to this idea of making sport karate better. And when we all unify behind that mission, whatever way that may be, that is ultimately where sport karate is going to find the most growth, right? So Carmichael, thank you for the question. That got me on my soapbox a little bit, talking about unity. And I guess that answers Richard's question too, of the biggest thing that's facing our sport is more people have to work together, right? And I'm not saying that directed at promoters or the heads of various leagues or whatever. That's on everybody, from the promoters to the judges and what tournaments they go and volunteer at, to the competitors and what tournaments and events and leagues they go support. That's on everybody to work together towards this common goal. I'm not singling out one group of people and saying that. That's a community-wide thing for sport karate. And so I'm going to keep reading on here. We're going to find some more questions. Like I said earlier, if you guys have any questions live, go ahead and drop those down in the comments below. And okay, this one I was excited about, because my answer to this question, I don't think that a lot of people are going to expect. And that is Drew Derek Bisbee, who says, would you like to see a trend in the traditional weapons divisions towards classical weapons forms, much like what has happened in the traditional Japanese empty hand forms divisions, right? So for context on this question, in recent years, there has been a shift on NASCA in particular to focus more on the WKF style, true traditional Japanese katas. And those are often the katas that we see winning on stage by the likes of Mason Stowell and Ariel Torres and Gabrielle Dunn, shameless plug for my fiance there. And so we see a lot of these great traditional competitors on stage winning and executing Japanese katas, right? And really, a lot of that should be credited to Jarrett Liker, who popularized that style of karate in the NASCA circuit. Really, before Jarrett Liker went on his tear and won a Warrior Cup and a U.S. Open and a Diamond Ring and had a really great run in his adult career, before that happened, a lot of the traditional forms that we saw were hybrid traditional forms. If you think that NASCA traditional weapons is essentially creative weapons right now, in a lot of ways, traditional forms was that way 10 years ago or so, right? I remember I ran a super hybrid form that was like 2 or 3 different traditional forms mixed together, and I made stage at the Diamond Nationals for it. I made stage at One Grand Championships multiple times over running that type of a hybrid form. Now, certainly I wasn't one of the best at doing that. You know, your Will Cornells and your John Sues and your Scott Woos and your Gabe Naga. Those were the guys who were really kind of setting the standard for those hybridized traditional forms. But in the last decade, largely because of the success of Jarrett Liker and a lot of his students, we've seen Japanese karate become increasingly popular, all the way up to the level of the guy who's been the best at it so far on the NASCA circuit, which is Ariel Torres, who's come about as close as you can get to being undefeated on the NASCA circuit in the traditional forms division. He's lost here and there, but it is rare. You can probably count on one hand the number of times that Ariel has not won the overall at a tournament that he's been at in the last 5 or so years. And so the question, though, is for traditional weapons, right? So there's been this shift that already happened in traditional forms. What about traditional weapons? Why does traditional weapons still look like essentially a creative weapons form without any releases or body rolls? And from some of the stuff that I've been seeing people doing traditional weapons recently, I've even seen like people getting away with some pretty creative looking manipulations. So how come when the divergence happened and traditional karate became popular in NASCA competition, why didn't that happen for weapons? And the question is, why, or what do I think? Should NASCA traditional weapons resemble more of that classical, true traditional, quote unquote, or kabuto weapons, right? Where it's the slower paced and the inch thick bows that aren't tapered, and you see ikus used or the oar used more commonly, things like that. And this will surprise people because you watch my traditional bow form and it's a NASCA style creative traditional bow form. I think that we should have more real traditional weapons forms on the NASCA circuit. I think that it should be a separate division. If you're going to have, so I think that it's twofold, right? So right now on the form side, we have the Japanese open traditional forms division. So it has to be a Japanese form, but otherwise it's open. You can do any form in that Japanese genre of forms, right? And then you have traditional challenge, which is strict. Specific katas have to be run with specific guidelines, very much like in the WKF with different rules and different refereeing, right? And so you have this split where here in the Japanese forms division, you could do an open style, mixed, hybrid, whatever you want to call it, Japanese style form. And then in the traditional challenge, you have to do the specific, more traditional version Japanese form, right? But what we see right now is the same forms winning in both divisions. And really, you don't see many people at all doing the quote-unquote hybrid traditional forms in the Japanese division. The people that are winning the Japanese division are the same people that are winning the traditional challenge division because they take the form they did for traditional challenge, they run it in Japanese Okinawan, and it winds up winning both divisions. Or the guy or girl that got second in trad challenge wins the division, and the guy or girl that got second in the division wins trad challenge, right? They trade back and forth like that. And so I think that my biggest thing bringing that up is that there should be more, I think that there's still a place for the hybrid traditional form. I think that still has a place. I loved watching those forms. There was nothing more exciting than watching Will Cornell take the stage for one of those forms at the Diamond Nationals. I loved it. And then after him, Brendan Wazinski, shout out to Brendan, right? Those were exciting forms to watch. One of my favorite competitors of all time is John Sue, who did kind of the open style of traditional form. I think that still has a place, right? So now we switch over to weapons, right? So if I feel, and I have to be consistent with my own opinion, right? If I feel that open traditional form still has a place in addition to, not instead of, but in addition to the traditional Japanese WKF style forms, at the same time, the traditional Kabuto style, true traditional weapons forms also have a place. We are an open circuit. NASCA is an open sport karate league. So under that definition, you should be able to show up with your traditional Iku form. And if you run that traditional Iku form better than anybody else runs their form at the tournament, you should be able to go and win the overall grand championship. Now, it's less likely that you're able to do that because there is one traditional weapons division, in the juniors at least, and then in the adults, it's split into bladed and non-bladed, right? Whereas in the bladed division, the open style of fast-paced creative, traditional sword form is favored. And in the non-bladed division, the fast-paced, creative style, traditional bow form is what's favored, right? And we've seen those style of forms winning for as long as I can remember. Those have been the style of forms that have been winning as long as I've been involved in sport karate. And so if somebody does show up and do their super traditional thick bow form or iku form or kama form or whatever it may be, the judges, it's almost like a risk if they go with that competitor, because the standard, what's been winning, what people see winning all the time, is the more contemporary style, right? And so for a judge to say, like, hey, that real traditional form was better executed than that high speed form, it's almost like that judge has to take a leap of faith and be like, no, I think this form was better, right? And then almost undoubtedly, that judge is going to get questions, right? The other judge that, has been giving it to the contemporary style, all day long, might give them a funny look, might say something. They might get a parent complain, which is a whole other story. That's complaining about a judge, or really complaining about a judge, should never happen. Now, a coach should be able to come up to a judge and ask for clarification. Hey, what'd you see? I'd like to help, my student do better. But when parents get involved in that, especially depending on the age of the kid, that becomes a whole other story that we could get into. So I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole yet unless somebody asks me specifically about it. But that's beside the point, right? My main point was that a judge almost has to take a leap of faith to pick one of the more true traditional weapons forms over a more contemporary style weapons form in the current era of NASCA, right? How do you solve that? If there's a traditional challenge for kata, let there be a traditional challenge for weapons, right? And you already have a name for it because you have a traditional challenge in the forms division. So give it a traditional challenge for weapons. Anybody that wants to do an iku form or a thick bow form or a kama form, a Kevin Thompson style traditional kama form from back in the day, I'd love to see that again, right? If somebody wants to do that, it can exist in the traditional challenge weapons division. And then the next thing that comes up is, well, Jackson, we already have so many divisions. There's hundreds of divisions that people compete in, right? Why would we want to add more and more and more divisions, right? Well, in my opinion, forget about the bladed, non-bladed thing, right? If you want, in traditional at least, in traditional, if you want to add a traditional weapons challenge, really, what's the point of separating the sword forms from the bow forms if the sword forms and the bow forms are going to eventually compete against each other in a grand championship anyway, right? So put the contemporary style sword forms with the contemporary style bow forms in the open traditional weapons division, and then make it, again, all weapons allowed in the traditional challenge weapons division. So that's what I would do to solve that problem. I do think that true traditional weapons forms have a place on NASCA, and they should have their own division and then go on to the grands to compete against the more contemporary style, right? Potentially. There's other ways that you could arrange the grands. And then on that same token, I would say on the form side, you have to act parallel to that, right? So don't make it such that Japanese Okinawan forms and traditional challenge are effectively the same division, that the same type of form wins every single time. Let there be a difference between those divisions as well, right? Make it so that there is a division where the open style traditional form is still accepted and has a chance to win. The traditional challenge division is where the true Japanese Okinawan forms are going to be favored. And then also, when all of those competitors go to the grand, shout out to Jeff Doss, because I know this is going to make you proud when I say this, give Korean forms competitors a chance, right? There are some great Korean forms competitors that sometimes get overlooked because there is such depth in the Japanese kata division. And it's gotten to a point where it's almost a given that whatever Japanese kata competitor is on stage is probably going to beat the Korean style competitor pretty easily. Some of that is because in recent years, the Korean division has not been as deep as the Japanese division, right? You don't have anybody right now in traditional forms in Korean that's as good at Korean as, say, Mason Stowell is at Japanese forms, right? You just don't have that right now. But if somebody did train themselves up to be as good at their Korean form as Mason Stowell is at his Japanese form, then that should be a closely contested, exciting division to watch, right? And I think that that's one of the reasons that a lot of people, particularly CMX competitors, sometimes argue that like traditional is boring on stage or this, that, and the other, right? Half of that is not being educated, not being able to appreciate what the true difficulty in a traditional Japanese form is. But the other half of that is you're watching the same Super Empe, Anandai, Kusanku. You're watching those same forms against each other over and over and over again, right? I would love to see a truly great Gaebek or Ulji go up against a truly great Anandai or Shatnyar Kusanku or whatever it may be, right? And that makes for an exciting division because you get a battle of the styles instead of, well, who does this one style better? Because at the end of the day, it is an overall grand championship. So it shouldn't be about, well, which of these two people from the same style does it better? It should be about which of these people from all these different styles do it the best. That's the meaning of an overall grand championship. That's the challenge of the division, is it being an overall title, right? So again, up on my soapbox, but I guess that's the point of a question and answer episode of the podcast, right? So like I said, everybody tuning in, thank you guys for staying tuned. I see Jesse King's in the house. Congratulations on the anniversary of Virtual Fight Tour. It was awesome to be commentating Virtual Fight Tour 10. I cannot wait for Virtual Fight Tour 11. So shout out to Jesse King and Virtual Fight Tour. Jesse Ray, that is. Jesse King's his Facebook name. Brandon Jones, how's it going, man? Asks how spectacular are beluga whales. They are magnificent. I love marine life, by the way. That's why I asked that. Jeannie Jones, thank you for tuning in, ma'am. She says, great points. I appreciate it. If any of this discussion elicits questions, make sure you drop them down in the comments below. We just got finished talking about traditional weapons and why there is still a place for open traditional weapons, but there should also be the more traditional style of traditional weapons as well. I think there's a place for both of them. Moving on to the next question. Let's see what we got here. Okay, this is a good one. Philip Brumet, I mean, all these are good ones, but Philip Brumet asks a really good one. How can we increase notoriety for the highest level athletes in our sport? Like how everyone knows Kobe Bryant, right? I think a lot of this can be controlled at the martial arts school level, and then there's also more that we can do as athletes to fix this, right? So what Philip is getting at here is that, you know, if you walk into any middle school in the middle of the NBA season, right, and you listen around the lunchroom, you're going to hear kids talking about, oh, LeBron this and Giannis that and Luka this, and you're going to hear all the kids talking about the best basketball players. And in the middle of football season, they're going to be talking about Brady, and they're going to be talking about Mahomes and Tyreek Hill. Those big sports, it's the big names become household names, right? So how do we make it such that sport karate becomes a sport that can produce household names like basketball and football? And you can't directly compare, you know, sport karate to things like basketball and football, but we can compare it to something like snowboarding. What we do, as far as the CMX goes especially, is very, very similar to what extreme snowboarders do. And I would say probably 80% of households in America have somebody in that house that knows who Shaun White is. Right? So how do we get to that level? Because we are an extreme sport, we are a niche sport. How do we get to where everybody in America knows who the best in sport karate is, just like they all know who Shaun White is, just like they all know who Tony Hawk is in skateboarding, the list goes on and on, right? So the first thing is, in general, making the sport bigger, as we've already talked about in this show. Sport gets bigger, household names become easier. But where I say that this lies in the hands of the martial arts school owners and partially in the hands of the competitors is this, right? If you're a martial arts school owner and you never mention, you're aware of sport karate and you know who all the best in sport karate are, and you never mention them to your students, you're missing an opportunity to inspire those students. The reason that I am still in martial arts to this day is not because of something that happened in my regular martial arts curriculum. It's because I went to the U.S. Open and I watched Matt Emig and I watched Lauren Carney and I watched Kalman Choka and I said, I want to be on that stage, I want to be on that team, and I want to win. And for me, Matt Emig and Kalman, for me, that was Kobe and LeBron, right? It was the same thing when I was growing up. Watching Matt and Kalman go at it was no different than watching Kobe and LeBron go at it, right? And it was because I had that opportunity to see them at U.S. Open. The vast majority of kids in martial arts schools all over the country have no idea that sport karate tournaments even happen. But if you, a martial arts school owner, start one class a week, right? Like on a Friday, a black belt class, right? Something that's fun. And start it by going over to the monitor and putting on a video of, hey, let's watch Sammy Smith and Haley Glass go at it at the Diamond Nationals, right? Let's look at Sammy's form. Let's look at Haley's form, right? Look at how awesome these two ladies are, right? Let's watch them go head to head, right? Or maybe you're somebody that doesn't like the CMX so much. So you say, you know what? Let's watch some traditional forms. Let's put, Gabrielle Dunn, and the girls can be inspired by her. And let's put, Mason Stowell and Ariel Torres, and the boys can be inspired by them. Let's put these traditional forms that are excellent up on the screen, right? So when you make those athletes superstars within your karate school and you say, this is what we want to be like, you're going to increase your retention. Because those kids are going to look up to those role models and they're going to say, I want to be like that. How are they going to be like that? They're going to keep coming back to class because that's what they know. That's how they learn martial arts. So the automatic connection is, oh, if I want to be like that guy that I saw on the monitor at the karate school, then I need to keep going along this path, right? And so in the hands of the martial arts school owners, take the time to promote those athletes, not just because it'll help those athletes, but because it will help your school. It's an easy way to increase retention. When you give people a role model, they will follow those role models, right? It's the social media age. So many kids nowadays are basing what they do with their free time on what they see their favorite TikTokers and YouTubers doing, right? I guarantee you, if there was a census done that looked at the rates of kids in boxing, there's so many more kids in boxing in the last 2 years than there are in the previous 10, not because of Anthony Joshua and guys like that, but because the role models for these kids, your YouTubers like your Jake and Logan Pauls and all that, they are boxing. And so when you have the people that these kids look up to doing something, those kids are going to base a lot of what they want to do on these role models that they're sitting on their iPads or their iPods or whatever and watching all the time, right? And so for martial arts schools, if you make the NASCO World Champions, for example, your superstars, those students are going to keep coming back because they want to then become those role models, and that is essential. And then there's the side of it that is on the athletes, right? As athletes, if we want to ever get the notoriety and the press and the publicity and the coverage that a Kobe Bryant or one of these big name athletes got, we have to act like it, right? And that means a lot of different things, right? It means little things, like on social media. I have seen in the past year way too much from a lot of different people in the martial arts community, teenagers and the like, on social media, right? Whether it's the bashing and the criticism of a world champion that's been around for years and has earned their stripes, and for some reason this person who is kind of new to sport karate is criticizing that world champion for really no apparent reason. I don't see where that comes from. That's not befitting of a professional. That's not befitting of someone that wants to be well known, right? And then forget martial arts in general, just people who post inappropriate things on social media, things of that nature, right? Like the first step is, if you want the athletes to be treated like professionals and to be a big deal, act like it. Act like a big deal. Act like a professional, right? So on the athlete side, it's cleaning up social media, making us look professional. And there's some athletes that do an incredible job of that. A lot of our Paul Mitchell guys do a great job of keeping their social media very buttoned up and professional and posting positive things about martial arts. And so that's one thing across the board. I think that Team Paul Mitchell does a really good job of that. And so that's one thing that's got to improve, right? But there's so many different aspects to this. Another aspect of it is when you go on stage, are you going up there and are you just doing your form to try to get the best score from the judges? Or are you going up there and putting on a show, right? What makes people fall in love with a guy like Kobe Bryant isn't just the fact that he puts the basketball through the hoop. It's the fact that he'll put the basketball through the hoop and then celebrate and then tear his jersey when he hits the game-winning shot. And it's a big deal, right? One of the most iconic Kobe Bryant moments came when he was off the basketball court. It was after his retirement game, right? I remember that he dropped 60 in his retirement game because I watched it, but so many people don't remember the game. They remember Mamba out. The way that he handled the interview afterwards, right? So it's not just about going on stage and doing your form or fighting your fight. What are you doing to be an entertainer? What are you doing to be a showman? What are you doing to become a character? That's one thing that I think that Virtual Fight Tour in particular, and a lot of the Pro Point did it as well, does a good job of, is turning some of these athletes into characters, right? I believe it was after a Virtual Fight Tour event when, Bailey Murphy grabbed the mic and he said, hey, I think I'm the best in the world right now. I am the best in the world right now. That was excellent because it makes him a character. It makes him somebody that people want to follow. Like, either people are going to be like, oh, well, I don't think Bailey's the best. I'm going to watch and see if he can prove me wrong. Or people are going to be like, you know what? I think he's right. I'm going to get behind him and support him, and we're going to see how far that can go, right? And then there's also everything that plays into that. So it's not just Bailey taking the mic, but it's also, I see Tyreek Saint chiming in. So thank you, Tyreek, for jumping in the chat here, right? It's the two of them, right? You have this friendly rivalry between Bailey and Tyreek, and they lift each other up, right? And Tyreek, you can probably tell the story better, but I think you and Bailey have both told this to me before about how, Bailey beat you at a regional tournament, and then you looked at him, and Tyreek, you looked at Bailey and said, I can beat you. I know I can beat you. Next tournament came around, and Tyreek beat Bailey, right? And so it's that type of thing. And when those stories go public, that create characters and make people want to follow these athletes, right? So as much as we can try to grow the sport, and as much as martial arts school owners and the martial arts community can try to lift up sport karate, a lot of it is on the athletes. In short, be professional and be entertaining. That's what it comes down to, right? When I go up on stage, right, anybody that's watched me live before knows that I don't just walk on stage and do my bow form, right? Especially in recent years, I would walk up on stage and I would pace down the side of the ring and I'd let out a big ki or something like that. I'd look out at the crowd. Sometimes I would engage with a little kid, like a wave or something like that, right? And it's not just, that's not random. It's not just me doing it just to be doing it. It's me doing that to put on a show, to be entertaining. Because that one kid that I made eye contact with and waved to before I turned around and did my form will remember that. And that kid remembering that might keep them in sport karate for an extra 10 years beyond what they thought they were going to do because they remembered that one time they saw me do that thing that inspired them, right? And that's something that across every top athlete in the sport should be doing. Forms, weapons, fighting, it doesn't matter. Be a professional at all times and be an entertainer, and that's how we get that increased notoriety. Whew, that was a good one. I'm gonna grab some water. I see everybody tuning in. Let's see, Jesse King talking about Kobe, I think, dropping on his Knicks. I think that retirement game was against the Jazz, wasn't it, actually? Anyway. All right, so now I'm going to jump back into, and by the way, everybody tuning in, thank you for tuning in. I appreciate the support. Drop any comments down below. This is episode 79 of the Jackson Rudolph podcast. We're answering user-submitted questions. If you've got questions right now, drop them down in the chat box. And by the way, it doesn't just have to be overall stuff about sport karate. You got questions about what I'm looking forward to at the Diamond Nationals, competitors I'm excited to watch. Drop those down in the comments too. I like those questions as well. But I'm going to jump back into some of these pre-submitted questions. The next few have a lot to do with each other, so this will be fun. So we got Jeff Doss from Inside Scoop, shout out to Martial Arts Center Network, says, what element of sport karate forms from the past would you like to see be brought back? And I'm actually going to read a couple of other questions with this because I think that they all tie in together pretty well. Because Michael Brumet followed that up shortly after. He said, based off of a fair number of comments I've seen recently, why does it seem that a fair number of people seem to think that the 90s was the peak of sport karate opposed to now or the generation before? And sport karate generations do kind of roll in 10-year generations, right? The 2010s era, the 2000s era. So Mike is saying, how come the 90s is what seems to be universally considered the golden era when you've got the 2000s, which were great, and then the 2010s, which were great as well? Why is it that the 90s is so coveted as this golden era, right? So I'm going to start by saying, I think that part of that is just a normal impact that we see in sports, right? Like if you're within NBA circles, right? I'm a big fan of the NBA. Within NBA circles, people talk about how like, like LeBron could never have played in the 90s and, Jordan was so much tougher and he played against the bad boy Pistons and all this. So a lot of it is people always glorify the previous generations, right? It's the good old days. People look back and, once you don't have something, you're not able to actively appreciate it anymore. So you appreciate it in retrospect. And that's what happens with, so many people saying that Jordan's better than LeBron. Half of that's because Jordan is better than LeBron, but that's beside the point. But I do think that there's a romanticism of previous generations, just like in any sport, right? How long did it take before everybody started admitting that Brady was the GOAT when they were saying Joe Montana was the greatest quarterback of all time? When, if you look at the tape, it's pretty clear that Brady's been the GOAT since probably before the last 2 Super Bowls that he won. But it wasn't until the last 2 Super Bowls, the Atlanta comeback and then the Tampa Bay win, that people said, okay, Brady's the GOAT, right? People talked about it, but it wasn't really accepted until these last 2 rings. Brady didn't need those last 2 rings to be the GOAT, and that's coming from a Jets fan. I'm getting off topic here, but my point remains that there's always this romanticism of the previous generation, right? But I do think there's also merit to it because the 90s is where a lot of the original innovation happened. And this is where I'm going to address Jeff's question, is much like many other people that are on these discussion boards and podcasts and things of that nature, there needs to be more active innovation in sport karate. Because if you do look back to the 90s and you look at what I call the great triumvirate of 1995, right? Where you had Mike Chat and John Valera and Carmichael Simon. And you look at the 3 of them compete against each other, they're all different. Like the things that made Mike Chat great are different than the things that made John Valera great, are different than the things that made Carmichael Simon great. And they each had individual contributions to the sport, right? John Valera had the manipulations of the commas that he introduced. Mike Chat had some of that as well. Mike Chat, I believe, was the first person to ever do a backflip in a form. That was one of his big contributions. Carmichael Simon with the mega combo, the tricking combo that went all the way kind of around the ring, the first 720, and so many other innovations that Carmichael Simon had, right? So there was a ton of innovation back then, and because sport karate was still very new, probably less than 20 years old at that point, especially the CMX stuff was brand new, open sport karate, the American division as they called it at the time. That was completely new. And so when something is completely new, you're going to see an exponential rate of innovation. And then as some of those things catch on and start winning, you're going to see a lot of replication. And so the innovation will plateau, right? And I think that that's a natural progression, right? A sport starts, an extreme sport in particular, we see all kinds of innovation, and then the innovation is winning, so people replicate the innovators, and then things plateau, and then eventually those innovations get stale, they become stagnant, and then you get a new spike of innovation, right? And so I think that you can see that in sport karate. You go from the big innovation spike of your Carmichael Simons and your Mike Chats and your John Valeras, and then you kind of get the plateau through the late 90s where they were still around competing, Chat and Valera in particular, and you had a lot of guys that were trying to do things like Chat and Valera, right? And then you get into the 2000s, and then eventually this guy comes along, Matt Emig. And Matt Emig doesn't look anything like Chat or Valera or Carmichael Simon, because at one point I firmly believe Matt was the greatest tricker on the planet, and Matt brought this brand new element of tricking into that forms division that had never been seen before. And his kicks had full extension, and he was pointing his toes, and he was executing very difficult tricks in combination. And then in contrast, here's the key. It wasn't just Matt. In contrast, you had Mark Canonizato, who had a very different looking style of tricking, who had a beautiful fully extended side kick, and overall had a completely different feel to his forms than Matt Emig did, right? And of course, there's others as well. Marcel Jones is a great example. Marcel's forms looked nothing like Matt's or Mark's, but Marcel was still one of the great forms competitors of that generation, right? And so then you see that other innovation spike. And then you see people trying to do what Matt and Mark and Marcel did, and you see replication for a few years, and then you get another innovation spike, right? The most recent innovation spike in the forms category, at least, would have been the major, tricking spike, where you had guys like Michael Guthrie and Jacob Pinto doing the gainers over and over and over again and throwing double corks consistently. And now I see 13-year-old kids throwing double corks in their extreme forms. It's insane. And so that was the next big innovation spike. And this is where I think, at least in the forms division, where one of the problems arises is that whereas if you looked at the martial arts part of it, the martial arts of Matt, Mark, Marcel looked different from one another, looked different from Chat, Valera, Simon, who each looked different from one another, right? But then when you look at the martial arts of kind of the 2010s era, as I'll put it, a lot of the hand combinations are the same. Chop, punch, ridge, chop, punch, chop, spear, chop, punch, right? Tutting, which don't get me started. But you see a lot of the same things in hand combinations. And then the difference is, well, who does the bigger trick, right? And then for some reason, regardless of how big the big trick is, oh, well, we're still going to do a skip front kick, jump front kick to get to the front of the ring. Or I can do a triple cork, but I'm going to do a flash kick to the back corner instead. So that's I think that's where kind of the most recent generation on the form side of things gets a little bit of slack, gets a little bit of flack, I should say, is that the innovation was different. It was bigger, harder tricks instead of different, more unique martial arts. And I think that's where a lot of the criticism from the old generation comes in. I see Carmichael Simon chiming in here. He says it was the transition from PKL adults to NASCA youth development, the translation from Media Karate Kid to implementing children programs. Absolutely, that's another part of it as well. And then in particular with the weapons side of things, that one gets a little bit more interesting because with weapons, whereas like in open forms, there was always, from the time that a backflip happened, it was gymnastics mixed with martial arts, right? Whereas with open weapons for a long, long time, it was just unique combinations of striking with minimal manipulation, right? There was no backflip equivalent in the weapons division. It was figure eights of the bow and finger manipulations of the kamas and rapid spins of the nunchucks. And so in the weapons division, it's different the way that the innovation happened because it really was primarily rooted in guys like Mike Bernardo, who focused on, innovating the way that strikes happen. When I had him on this podcast, he talks about, in a lot of traditional styles, the way that you would do a thrust with a bow would keep the palm up or only slightly rotated. It was really him who introduced rotating the wrist all the way over on a thrust, something that we as bow practitioners in the modern era just assume was always how it is. Bernardo started that for the purposes of competition. So that was something that was born of martial arts, right? Strictly martial arts, the striking of a bow, right? And then we get this next evolution where body rolls becomes popular through the likes of Nate Andrade and Ross Levine. And as Ross Levine would famously say in some of his introductions, right? My form has no flips, no kicks, and no throws, just bow. So unlike myself, when Ross and Nate were doing forms, they weren't releasing the bow. So they were still focused on the striking, but then when they would stop striking, they would roll the bow around the body, right? And then you kind of get into your intermediate between Ross and guys like myself, which is Corey Lutkus, who was mixing together body rolls and releases and was very successful at doing so. And then kind of came the time when I had my come up and was able to secure some overall grand championship wins by linking together long combinations of bow releases. And so, whereas with forms, I see the evolution more as spike and innovation, plateau, spike and plateau. I feel like in the weapons division, there's been, at least with regard to bow, there's been more of a steady climb from basics to manipulations, to body rolls, to releases, to release combinations. It's been a different evolution. And I think that you can apply that same thing to other weapons as well, right? With sword releases being innovated, right? So originally, creative sword was primarily a whole bunch of different cuts. And then, of course, you got the releases of the single sword, and then from the releases of the single sword, from the likes of like a Johnny Lascar and Joshua Corton, right? And then you get on to a Kalmanchoka, who said, well, I'm going to bring out two swords, and that was the way that sword developed, right? Nunchucks is an exception because Matt Emig just completely changed the nunchuck game, and that was like a huge jump from what other people had done before. So that doesn't necessarily quantify. Kamas, I feel like, was relatively similar to the bow progression, right? You saw basic cuts to manipulation of kamas with wrist rolls and things of that nature by Chat and Valera. And then you move on to a guy like Rudy, who's a student of Valera, right? And so you have Rudy, who introduces more complex finger rolls, but still wasn't releasing the kamas. And then you have a Tyler Weaver, who started releasing the kamas all the time. And then that was a part of a whole big generation of great kama releasers. Michaela Johnson, Cole Presley, Austin Crane, Mackenzie Emery, the list goes on and on and on, right? A bunch of great kama releasers in that most recent generation. So in general, I feel like that's the way that the evolution has kind of transpired. Let me get back to the original question so that I don't miss my point here in the midst of my storytelling. Oh, but what element of the old 90s style sport karate forms would I like to see back? I'd like to see more of the original innovation. I tell my students all the time that even though you want to learn how to throw your bow up and spin 3 times, even though you want to learn how to spin your bow on the finger, even though you want to learn how to kick your bow up in the air and catch it, being me is not going to push the sport forward. And so I actively tell my students, be different. Don't be like me. I'm honored that you look up to me and that you want to be like me, but I didn't become who I am by doing something that somebody else already did. I did it by carving my own path, by finding my own style, by discovering this innovation. And if you want to be great at CMX Sport Karate, that's what you have to do. You have to find something that is different, that is an escape from what other people have done before. Take that risk, because when I did it, it was a risk. I did not know that it was going to work. When I made up the first form that had a release combo going all the way across the front of the ring, and I think it had 14 total releases in it, when most bow forms of that era had maybe 4 or 5 at the most, I didn't know it was going to work. There was a chance that I did that form and I got laughed out of the ring because the judges said I did too many releases. They didn't. They loved it. I started winning, and then I stuck with it, right? And then one thing that I always stayed true to that people from outside sport karate don't always see is that I always made sure that there was a greater number of strikes than there were tricks in the form. And so that's something that any kids watching this, I will caution you. Do not innovate and lose sight of your martial arts basics. I always, down to mathematical precision, guaranteed that there were more striking techniques in my form than there were trick techniques in my form. Because if the form had been more tricks than strikes, absolutely that would become a problem, and you shouldn't be able to win if you're doing more tricks than you are strikes, because at the end of the day, it is a martial arts competition. So yes, innovate, but that doesn't mean just do more and more and more tricks. It's not always the hardest form that wins. It's the most unique form. And I'm going to pause because that has gravity. It's not the hardest form that always wins. It's the form that stands out. It's the form that is unique. It's the form that makes a judge rock back in their chair and say, I've never seen anything like that. That's what wins consistently. You can have a really hard form and win the US Open once. You can have a really hard form and win a Warrior Cup once. If you want 7 Warrior Cups, a whole bunch of US Opens, a bunch of diamond rings, you want to win consistently, change the sport for the better. Do something different. Carve your own path. Do something different from what everybody else has done before you. Take the risk and it just might pay off. And if it doesn't, go back to the drawing board and innovate something else. That's my message. All right, I felt good about that. Was that good? I felt good about that. Anyway, we're gonna jump back into the comments here. Isaac Costley tuning in. Master C, thank you for chiming in. Let's see, martial sports, martial astics, which is play on gymnastics or martial arts, there should be a difference. Absolutely, there should definitely be different categories for those things. Mindy Miller, the mother of Aiden Miller, one of my students, says body rolls just don't look like karate. To each his own on that. I mean, releases don't look like karate either, but it's entertaining, so that's why we do them, right? Carmichael Simon, could not agree more. Flash is trash without the basics. Charlie Lee, June Ree quote. That's it. That's all you got to say. Flash is trash without the basics. If you don't have the basics, then the flash isn't going to matter, right? Next question. We're getting to the end of some of the pre-submitted questions here. I don't want to be on the show for too much longer. So if you guys have questions live in the chat right now, go ahead and drop them in there. But now we're going to go ahead and move on to another 2 questions that I'm going to, I'm not going to read them together, but they're grouped together. So first we have Dax Howland. Shout out to Dax, member of Team Competitive Edge. Just won his first U.S. Open title a couple months ago. So Dax, shout out to you, my man. Dax says, what kind of things can us kids do as the next generation to help our sport grow? Because it's legit the best sport ever, and even more kids and people need to know about it. 3 exclamation points. How can us younger martial artists keep with us the awesomeness and influence of all the past and current legends who have paved the way for us to do what we do, especially in CMX, while we also continue to grow with the evolution of our sport? Thank you, sir. I'm excited to hear all your answers. Dax, thank you for the question. And I feel like I answered this question with a lot of my previous monologue. But one thing that I want to point out about this is the enthusiasm, right? That's one thing that amazes me about Dax, is how enthusiastic he is about sport karate. And Dax, to answer your question, what we need is more kids like you. We need more people that love sport karate, that get excited about it, and that respect those previous generations. I can't tell you how many times I've had a student that I told a story about Kalman Choka, or about Matt Emick, or about John Valera, or about Carmichael Simon, or whoever it was, that I've told the story, and then they went, who? And I was like, no. And then automatically I jump into education mode, because you have to know where the sport comes from. You have to know how that evolution has evolved. And so the way that you frame that question, Dax, where you're excited about it, and you say, how can we be as awesome as these past legends? It's that respect for the past that will inform your future. Study the ways that the previous legends innovated, and that will tell you what you can do to find success in your own career. So maintain that passion, chase those dreams, and keep loving sport karate. And in loving sport karate, study that history, because that is incredibly valuable, right? I saw a question come in, so I'm going to address this real quick before we get to the next topic, which is, oh, this is an interesting one. So Tyreek Saint says, do you think that the fighting ring size should be bigger? I would have to think about this more. I will say that I really liked what I've seen with the amount of action that we get in VFT with the enclosed ring. So having the cage in a slightly smaller space when you have 3 judges in there as well, plus the 2 fighters, of course, I like the elevated level of action that we see in the smaller ring. So if you were just asking me out of the blue, I would say, here's the problem. If you make a ring smaller in an open tournament where you have no boundaries, you're just going to have fighters falling out and running out of the ring more often. So I think, Tyreek, that what you're getting at, correct me if I'm wrong here, is what if we had a bigger ring? I think that like the Irish Open rings are quite a bit bigger than like the NASCAR ring, right? If you had a bigger ring for the point fighting divisions, it'd be a lot harder for fighters to just fall out of the ring or run out of bounds, things of that nature. There'd be a lot more area that is in play, which is going to force there to be some more action in kind of a roundabout way. So I'd have to think about that some more. Obviously, not being a fighter myself, I'd like to collect the opinions of more fighters to kind of like weigh what they have to say. I do know that a lot of fighters love the way they do it over at Waco, which is why Waco is such a big fighting league. Tyreek confirms, yeah, Waco rings are 8x8. So sure, maybe having those bigger rings would be better. I can definitely see how it'd be better for fighter and spectator safety, because with a bigger ring, you give the fighters more room to fight, and you decrease the probability of collisions with spectators or going into the stands, going into the scorekeeper's table, things of that nature. So it's definitely an improvement for fighter safety if you get the bigger rings. I think one thing that Europe benefits from is they, on average, have much larger venues. Their typical exhibit hall that they compete in is a lot bigger than the typical American hotel ballroom, where rings are often right on top of each other. So there's a lot of NASCAR venues that I don't know how you would fit 8x8 rings into outside of the U.S. Open, right? So I think that that's one of the factors that makes it tough at American tournaments, is that there's very commonly a limited amount of space to fit as many rings as possible into. But I would definitely be willing to hear different thoughts on that. Let's see. Tyreek adds smaller ring equals less strategy. I can see that because we do see a lot more of you're on the line blitz, right? Throw the defensive sidekick, throw the reverse punch. So it is, in a way, I can see what you mean, that it's a simpler game when you're kind of forced to stand in there. I'd also like to hear any fighters that have a contrary opinion. Are there any fighters that like a smaller ring? Go ahead and drop those thoughts in the comments below. So Tyreek, that's a good discussion. I'd have to think about that more to really form an opinion on it. But right now, I can see that both ways. So now we're going to move on to the next big pre-submitted topic, and I really want to get to this one. So absolutely keep dropping questions down in the comments. I'm loving the participation. But here's a big one. Here's a big one that I wanted to address. So Jacob Wood asks, as a lot of us that have grown up in CMX-style martial arts have witnessed, more traditional martial arts, parentheses, obviously not everyone, but this is more of a generalization, hate on this sport karate style and often say that it isn't even martial arts at all. Do you feel as if CMX is being misjudged, or do you think we as a sport need to make changes to become more quote-unquote martial, or both maybe, right? So here's the big thing with this, right? If you are a sport karate competitor and you don't believe in what we are doing, then you need to question being a sport karate competitor, right? Because in order to be a successful sport karate competitor, you have to embrace this sport that everybody in this community loves doing. I've already said it's not for the money, it's not for the fame. If you're in a sport karate tournament, it is because you love sport karate. So that is the first and most important thing, is that anybody who loves going to a sport karate tournament should not be openly critical about the art of sport karate itself. It's one thing to be critical of the way that sport karate can be disorganized, or to be critical of the lack in innovation. But to make a generalization and say that sport karate as a whole isn't real martial arts isn't helping this community continue to move forward, right? And so I want to start by saying that. But I do think that a legitimate point is raised in how do we combat all of these other martial artists that fall behind the old catchphrase, that wouldn't work on the street, that's not real martial arts, right? And I think that the biggest thing is we as competitors can change that, right? So when you're developing a hand combo, right, I have a firm belief, great hands can win you a division, bad hands can lose you a division. The actual techniques that you throw don't matter, right? Granted, if you did basic chop punch your whole form, you probably don't have a chance to win. But if you have some baseline level of creativity with your hand combos, whatever level of creativity that is will not win you or lose you the division. Great hands, technique-wise, will win you the division. Bad hands will lose you the division. The content, as long as it's not way too basic, really doesn't matter too much in the winning and losing of the division, right? And so if you're putting together hand combos, and the same thing goes for striking with your bow or cutting with your combos or striking with your chucks or whatever, right? But I'm just using hands as an example. If you're creating hand combos in which you're doing things where instead of throwing a chop and a punch and a ridge hand or a middle block or martial arts techniques, and you're using a space in a form that is reserved for martial arts when you're in a front stance and throwing hand techniques, and instead you do something like make a box and then cross your arms and then do something that comes more from breakdance than it does from martial arts, that is a problem, right? That is where somebody that is a traditional karate stylist looks at this and says, he didn't hit or block anything with that. You tell me that when he's tricking, well, that's the performance side, so when he or she is doing hands, that should be the martial arts side, right? So what is this? Or what is this? Or what is, right? And I understand there's a baseline level of creativity, right? Like if I wanted to go from an X block or something like that and roll into a spear hand or something like that, that's different. That's creativity. If you have multiple techniques in a row that would not hit or block anything, that is part of the problem. That's where some of the perception comes in, right? So the way that we construct our hand techniques and our basics is a big part of it, right? Another thing, let's say that you have some relatively minor flaw, like your back leg bends on your front stances. It's a common mistake that a ton of competitors make. Let's say that you're a good competitor and you have that flaw, right? But because you have the fastest hands in your division, you have the cleanest hands in your division, and you have the most difficult tricking in your division, you still win all the time, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, a competitor that has the fastest hands, the cleanest hands, and the best tricking should not lose to someone who's worse in all three of those categories just because one kid bent their back leg and the other person didn't. However, as long as that winner continues to just be content bending their back leg just because they're winning, every traditional martial artist that looks at that and sees the back leg bent on a front stance where it should be straight is going to be like, wait a minute, that's not even right. How does this kid win all the time? Right? And so part of your responsibility to master your basics as a sport karate competitor isn't just to win your division. It's to make us look better. Our sport is going to be judged by the quality of our champions and the quality of our champions as martial artists, right? If you're a world champion forms competitor, you should probably be able to hit a proper front stance, right? And so that's where a big part of the issue comes in. And that's not a judging problem. Because like I said, it's good judging for better, faster hands with better tricking to beat a form with less of that, but a better front stance. That is good judging. That's 3 categories to 1. And let's add on top of it, for example's sake, that the other competitor is also more intense and everything about their form is better except for the back leg. The judges are right to give it to the kid with the bent back leg. So that's not on the judges. That's on us as competitors to increase our standard for basic techniques. Where you can argue that it does fall more in the hands of the judges is when it comes to point fighting and the criticisms of point fighting that fully extended damaging techniques don't ever get thrown, right? And the famous example of this is when a bent leg defensive side kick that did not move the opponent, but simply the foot touches the scoring surface with the knee still bent. One of my biggest point fighting pet peeves is when I see that score. Right? I cannot stand it when somebody's chambered foot touches somebody's torso and then they get 2 points for it, right? I can't, that is a big pet peeve for me, right? And so that is on judging, and maybe not even on the judges, but on judging education. So the tournament holding the black belt meeting, the rules of the league, things of that nature. It's not just on one group of judges. That could be a systemic thing, right? But if we want to be held to a higher standard, if we want other martial artists to respect sport karate, then if we're going to score 2 points for a side kick, especially if it's 2 points for a side kick to the body, if it's going to be that valuable, then it better be a fully extended side kick that stops the momentum of the opponent. And I'm pretty sure that's how it's written in the rule book as well, despite the fact that we still see a chambered leg side kick touch somebody's torso and they still get 2 points for it, right? And so that's one improvement that could be made. And then also on the point fighting side, I've heard Alex Dingman of Inside Scoop talk about this before. Sometimes with certain panels of judges in certain situations, you know that if you just take off and push off and make contact, even if you're like this, if you make contact and you're the aggressor, that the judges are going to point your direction, right? At the end of the day, our job as competitors is to show up and win. And so if you're throwing this over and over and it's scoring, or if you're throwing a chambered defensive side kick that doesn't extend over and over and it's scoring, that's not the competitor's fault for continuing to throw that technique. It's on the judges for calling the technique that really isn't a technique, right? So it goes both ways. Sure, could point fighters try to make sure they always extend their techniques better and show them off? Sure, they could try to. But when they get scored on by a fighter that's getting there first because their technique is incomplete because the complete technique takes longer, and the judges are scoring to the incomplete technique because it touched first, you can't blame a fighter for throwing the incomplete technique in response to that to try to get there first because that's what the judges are scoring off of, right? So in general, I think that in forms and weapons, a lot of it comes down to the competitors holding themselves to a higher standard in terms of their traditional martial arts, and for the fighters trying to maybe change the rules, increase judging education so that those mistakes aren't made and techniques that aren't really techniques don't wind up scoring points. I'm seeing some comments roll in, so I'm going to read through these real quick. Drew Derek Bisbee says they need to push spectators back about 5 feet all the way around the ring. I agree. I don't think that competitors should be not allowed to enter the tournament area at all, because that takes away one of the greatest elements of sport karate, which is the everybody crowded around the ring for a big runoff that's high stakes at the Diamonds or at the US Open or whatever. That atmosphere is unique to sport karate. I've not seen that atmosphere anywhere else. So we have to maintain that atmosphere. But by a mandatory, 5 feet away from the ring with some tape around it or whatever, you don't lose that atmosphere and you make it safer for everybody, right? So I 100% agree. I think about 5 feet is perfect. Move everybody 5 feet back. You still get the hyped environment, but you increase safety and professionalism. I think that that's important. Carmichael adds, the best competitors have the most amazing transitions, switches, spins between hand and tricking sections. The fundamental basics are still necessary to support this transition. All right, we're running out of time on this show, but Carmichael, could not agree more. Kids, any extreme forms competitor watching this, or comma competitor, because you guys do it a lot too, the next time that I see someone do this and put their weight on one leg and lift one hand up and then wind up before they start their tricking combination, the next time I see that, I think I'm going to explode, because that is how everybody, their aunts, their uncles, and their mom starts their tricking combos. Stop it. Start your tricking combos a different way. Go straight from a punch and go into the tricking combo. Find something else to do that's not putting your weight on one leg and lifting your palm up in front of you. Find some other way to innovate that. So that's a pet peeve of mine. I had to address that. Let's see. Drew adds, just because a hand or foot makes contact with a legal target area does not mean it's a point. Absolutely. Thank you very much. You're preaching to the choir. A technique should have to be thrown to completion in order to score, right? That doesn't mean excessive contact, but it means the technique needs to be thrown to completion with some level of control in order to score in a point fighting match. I agree. So as we close out the show here, any last second questions, go ahead and throw those in the chat. I'll try to address them very quickly. I had another couple of little ones that I think I wanted to get to. We talked about bringing back the hype from previous generations. That was another question that I got. Scrolling through some of the Instagram questions that were submitted. Looks like a lot of stuff that we pretty much already covered. Sammy Smith, we got to get her back on the show again soon for maybe a Diamonds preview episode. Let me know down in the comments if you guys want to see that. But Sammy asked a good one, and this is a good one to kind of bring things together. And by the way, if there's any other quick questions, throw those down in the comments. I got a little less than 10 minutes left that I'm going to go here. But Sammy says, are you happy with the current direction of the sport, or what would you like to see change? And I think that this is a good opportunity to bring everything together that we've been talking about so far, and that I've been talking about, that hopefully this inspires other discussions for, right? Is that I hear a lot of people that talk about sport karate, and then they voice this very grave opinion that I don't like where the sport is at, and I don't know what the future holds, and there's not as much talent as there used to be, and none of the tournaments can get along, and all these grim forecasts for the next era of sport karate, right? The next era of sport karate has not truly started yet. There is time to change that. And we change it together on the level of the competitors, on the level of the parents or spectators that are very involved in the events, many of them as scorekeepers, on the level of the judges, on the level of the tournament promoters, on the level of the league executives, and on the level of the media, all of us who cover it, like I do now with Black Belt Magazine and through this podcast and all of the other media outlets that have come up. Every major role player in this community that we love of sport karate has to buy in order to keep this sport going, right? This sport can continue to improve and get better, but we have to work together to make that happen. And that is the biggest take-home message that I can provide. And honestly, in the conversations that I've had and that I've heard amongst others, there are more people trying to make sport karate big right now than there are maybe in the history of our sport. You don't necessarily see it on social media. It's not always public because a lot of these things need to be kept quiet in order for things to actually come to fruition because there is so much division that happens. But there are more people right now invested in making sport karate a big deal than there maybe has ever been in the history of this sport. And so for anybody tuning in, let that be a beacon of hope that there is more to come for this sport. There is a future in which athletes make a living off of sport karate. I firmly, wholeheartedly believe that. And that's one of my life goals, is to help sport karate become that. Become something where you don't have to use sport karate to go into stunts, to open a karate school, to get into college, this, that, and the other. But to make it a sport where you can be a professional sport martial artist, and that is your livelihood. That is real. That is possible. But it's only possible if we believe it and we work together and we don't tear each other down with this constant grim outlook on, well, this is wrong and this is wrong and this person does this wrong and everything is so bad in this sport. We have to be optimistic. We have to work together and we have to have faith that the people who love this sport most are doing everything they can to make it what we've always wanted it to be. I'm Jackson Rudolph. That was episode 79 of the Jackson Rudolph podcast. And I'll see you next time.